A pleasure to meet all at last, and welcome back to films I should have talked about years ago. So what we got going on for today's pick is simply going to be a much older film than I would have typically gone for. But the thing is, it's a pretty campy and likable classic. 1954's Them. The story of how atomic testing in New Mexico goes wrong. And the unofficial message to Earth that if nukes continue to detonate, crazy things are bound to happen. Not just from extreme exposure to harmful radioactive elements, from cobalt to cadmium, but also ginormous mutations. You see, what this film basically explores is the understanding of how radioactive mutation can occur within one's genetic compound and chemistry. Bodily fluids and all other things can basically be altered in a certain way. Organs could possibly be fried or changed in a different way. Your blood could basically be completely annihilated from the blast, or from exposure to radiation, it could possibly be done any other way. There's hardly any known understanding of how exactly does radioactive exposure leading to genetic mutation possibly occurring, but there are plenty of people out there who can understand the many effects that initial exposure to radioactive materials of any sorts, the many things that they can do to your body, or potentially anything else. But the truth is that this movie does something entirely different. It basically centers around the state of New Mexico, a big site for nuclear testing. There's plenty of deserts, open areas, spaces to analyze how big the blasts can be and what kind of areas they can impact. But one day, a nuke goes off, and when a team of hazmat workers goes out there to investigate, it turns out that giant holes in the ground have been made. And these giant holes weren't necessarily done as a result of things like liquefaction, sinkholes, mud caverns, earthquakes, or etc. This was entirely different. It turns out that the nukes that were dropped down there in New Mexico itself have actually affected the population of ants living in the area. When they were exposed to this extreme amount of radiation, they grew to massive sizes. They grew unbelievably large by any means. And it is in fact an epic hasting, where giant ants are now walking the earth, destroying everything in their path, killing all sorts of people, their giant incisors, antennae, and legs. Well, you could just say this might have been a precursor to all those giant bug films like Eight-Legged Freaks, for example. This one is also fairly well known, even to this day, for what it is. The story of a giant spider being followed by groups of giant spiders that are wreaking havoc amongst civilization. It turns out in this film, the same exact thing happens. But because this was one of the first to ever make such a big impact, at the time at least, it was no wonder why there's a lot of films that center on giant bugs. Giant bugs of all sorts, including the famous scene from King Kong, which was originally made for the 1933 film but was then scrapped. And Peter Jackson would eventually take this exact scene from the original movie that was supposed to be completed, and he managed to perfect it on his own. So it turns out that giant bugs happen to be a bit of a cultural hit amongst film as well as TV shows, music, and other such stuff. And probably the best known instance that I could find would be the Araneos and the broodmother Lycerix from Ark Survival Evolved. That's probably the best that I could potentially come up with as a good example of how giant bugs have been thriving along in more modernized pop culture. But back to Them. Them continues with giant ants destroying cities and whatnot, till eventually government starts stepping in, and basically there's this one moment in the whole film that I specifically remember pretty dang well. when man entered the atomic age, nobody can predict. It's a quote like this that was definitely inspirational for this sort of time. It shows that when there's always a technological advancement, there's always both a pro and a con to it. The pro can be that they can be very effective in helping society in many different ways. But the con is that there's always consequences to such large advancements. This is a thing that has been around for science for way too long. And until the day does come where we can actually find a way to perfect our own tech without causing any sort of disturbance or any other potential disaster from happening, we're definitely going to have to put a lot of research into it. So I do feel that, for one, with the current tech that we have, our smartphones can be a pro because they can help make life easier. They're easier to hold with their thin profile, they can be easy to use with touchscreen, and they can also be very versatile in terms of utilizing different functions. Telling time, using calculators, jotting down notes, and of course, finding your next ride over to the local restaurant. But there's always the con to this. In the same way that the nuke, in addition to creating extreme amounts of damage and releasing radioactive materials all throughout the area, which can contaminate this area for decades at least. And this movie basically shows that genetic mutation as a result of radioactive exposure is likely to happen. We have seen genetic mutations, and they are terrifying to say the least. Probably the most notorious case would have to be with Agent Orange, a chemical substance used by the American military, especially during World War III. Down there in Vietnam, Operation Ranch Hand, 20 million gallons were sprayed all over Southeast Asia. And it was unbelievable what the effects were like. At a genetic level, so many things had happened to the people who experienced the poisoning and exposure to Agent Orange. Thankfully, though, after a lot of regulation has been put together, and eventually the Chemical Weapons Convention of 1993 took over and allowed for Agent Orange to be stowed away and kept locked up, never to be used again. So, of course, this smartphone also has a few cons. For one, it doesn't necessarily have the best sort of way to hold the charge on a battery, so at least compared to some models which can do better than this, there's always the likelihood that another model can do better than this one. Of course, a few other pros apart from this one is that it was one of the least expensive that I can get brand new. $500 I paid for this SE3. So, again, pros and cons happen with all sorts of things. Advancements in technology, weaponry, and warfare amongst different nations, it's known to happen all the time. And as the years go on, we're going to find different ways to repel different kinds of attacks. We can get creative with any sort of asset that we can have to our advantage. But at the same time, there's always going to be a thing that'll put a burden on us for the rest of our lives. And by the end of this film, the Queen Ant is defeated and life is basically restored back to normal. Nukes are kept at a lot of different laws, so that way they can be more safer to use, safer to test, safer to detonate, without harming anybody at all. So with that in mind, thank you very much for watching this piece. I highly recommend this film for a lot of good reasons. Apart from the giant ants destroying the cities, apart from the unique story, and apart from the incredible, inspiring message that this can bring onto Earth, even to this day, I give this one a scoring of 7.7 out of 10.1. So with that in mind, that just completes my review on this film. Pretty incredible to say the least for 1954. But if you want to see more, go down to my channel, then make sure that you like, subscribe, comment, follow me on social media, and stay on the Hollywood side.